Hey, day 69, it's about time. And it really is about time because, of course, it's linked to the endocrine system, which is how your body keeps track of time. Our target today will be able to explain at least 4 endocrine pathways, the basics of the endocrine system, and then how negative feedback plays a role in that. So we dig deeper into what we did started the last time. Now, the story, of course, goes along with you're preparing yourself for GR 49 and 50, but hopefully you did 45 before you're doing this entry task. Then you did your endocrine pathways mini poster, so you'd be prepped for this and have an idea what I'm talking about. And the 2017 FRQ is coming up and due. Now, key thing we should notice, of course, this is Grandma Simpson before and after, when she was young and spry, and then she shrank. Got all wrinkly and stuff. What's up with that? Wouldn't that be nice? 0 papers? Would have been on this day. This is also the story of this little monster. He's tiny, and he's hungry, and someday he'll probably be bigger than his daddy. So, how do those two things connect? This little monkey and this shriveled old lady? Well, it all comes down to this beautiful thing called calcium. And if you think calcium, you better think about something called PTH and a thing called calcitonin. I want to know how those two things are linked and function together in an endocrine pathway. So, pause me, write down the question, give it a try on your own while I get rid of my big ugly head, and then I will try it with you, virtually. Cool. One thing you hopefully recognize that your body needs is this wonderful stuff called calcium ions. Calcium does the body good. And when we look at that calcium, of course, we need that to maintain this wonderful thing known as homeostasis. And in your body, you carry calcium around in your blood. So your blood calcium levels should be about 9 to 11 milligrams for every 100 milliliters of blood. Which doesn't sound like much, but it's quite a bit if you think about the concentration of that stuff. Now, the other thing that we should recognize is that there are times in your life when that level gets too high. So let's say that, of course, you have a stimulus, because this is an endocrine pathway. And the stimulus is that your blood calcium levels have gotten too high, right? Maybe you ate too much ice cream. I've been known to do that. It's okay. Now, when it gets too high, of course, that means that some endocrine cell, because it always goes stimulus and then your sensors, the endocrine cells, the sensors are always watching. And what they notice, of course, is in this case, it's the thyroid gland that's watching. Now, your thyroid sitting there right below your voice box. And that thyroid gland, of course, is sitting right in that area. It looks kind of like a big old butterfly, right? Now, what the thyroid is watching is that calcium levels that are going there. If it notices that the calcium level gets too high, then it does what all good endocrine cells do. It secretes. And the secretion that it sets out is pretty obvious. It's called calcitonin. One of those names that actually makes sense. Calcitonin levels will increase, and it's secreting them in an endocrine fashion into the blood. Now, crucially, it sends it out to the entire body. Calcitonin levels are rushing out there, and it's going for its target cells. Now, there are only certain cells that are listening to this, and one of the cells that's listening to this is located in those beautiful bean-shaped organs called your kidneys. Almost wrote bean there. Now, if we look at this, the kidneys are going to do a crucial thing. You've got too much calcium in your body, so your kidneys are going to filter it out and allow you to pee it out. So they're going to decrease the amount of calcium uptake that they're reabsorbing in their distal and proximal tubules, so more of it goes into your filtrate, into your pee, and you get rid of that calcium. In addition, of course, your calcium comes from something, your food. So that means it's actually going to trigger your small intestine to do a nice thing for you. It's going to decrease its calcium uptake too, which means you're going to take less from all that ice cream so that you don't have to pee out less of it because you want it to drop, right? At the same time, of course, you think calcium, you better think, hey, good for your bones. This is going to stimulate your bones because there's too much calcium inside of your blood to actually take the calcium ions and uptake it and build bone. They're going to deposit it in the bone to take it out of the blood. When they do that, it activates these cells called osteoblasts. And blasts, of course, is a typical term that we'll see a lot of in biology. Blasts are builders, like a blastocele was building itself the body cavity. And osteo means bones. So these guys start taking it out of the blood and depositing in the bones, making your bones good and strong. Hey, does the body good, right? Now, what this means is all of these things, decreasing the uptake of calcium, excreting it out of your body, or putting it in the bones, means that you've gone through a response. And their response of those target cells does a great thing. It takes the blood calcium levels, and they were too high, so it decreases them. And if it decreases them enough, then they can get down to that homeostasis level where they're nice and healthy, right? But let's say that they, pee out a little too much or build too much bone. That's going to cause a problem. It's going to drop below 9 milligrams, and that would create another stimulus. This stimulus being that our blood calcium levels have dropped too far. If it drops below that, then they are too low for your healthy function of your body because calcium does a lot for you. So who would notice that? Well, it's an endocrine cell. And we know the thyroid was watching calcium levels, but on top of it, beside it, on that butterfly-shaped thyroid gland, are these little smaller glands called the parathyroid, which makes sense. Para means beside, so it's beside the thyroid gland. And these endocrine cells, of course, do what's best. They're sensing, they're watching, and they're secreting, because that's what they always do. Secretion, of course, goes into the blood. And what are they going to secrete here? Well, this is going to increase the release of what's called parathyroid hormone, PTH. The PTH, of course, goes out to the entire body because it goes into the blood. But it's targeting cells, and its target cells are in the tissues. So tissue target cells, as those cells are targeted, one of the best places to find lots of calcium is in those bones, right? As PTH meets up with the bones do a crucial thing. You don't have enough calcium, so they're going to release calcium ions back out into the blood. So they're not going to build bone, they're going to destroy it. And who does that are these things called osteoclasts. Clast means destroyer or depolymerizer, right? And osteo means bone. So it's a bone destroyer. As they do that, of course, it now goes back into the blood. So we're kicking into our response phase of this. Also, of course, we have this problem. We don't have enough calcium. So where are we going to get it from? We're going to get it from our diet. This changes your intestines' behavior. And now they'll increase their calcium uptake. So they're taking more from your yogurt and stuff, which is why it's good for your body. Likewise, your kidneys, if you're low on calcium, you want your filter organ, your kidneys, to save that stuff. So it's going to increase the number of channels that are dedicated to taking up the calcium and increase the uptake of it so that in all of those things, destroying the bones, taking it up from your food, and saving it from your pee means that blood calcium levels will increase. And if we increase the levels, of course, we can bring ourselves back to homeostasis. If it goes a little too far, well, then, of course, the body will notice it and the thyroid will release calcitonin. If it goes too low, then the body will notice and it will release PTH and keep this thing in a dynamic kind of teeter-totter that goes back and forth and never balances just right, but it's getting pretty darn close, and that's a chemical control. It's like chemical equilibrium from chemistry last year, right? We should notice what we have here, of course, is a negative feedback. This is a negative feedback loop. In between, of course, this stuff called calcitonin. As calcitonin decreases, that could, of course, cause more of that calcium to drop off in the blood, and then you get the decrease of the PTH, or vice versa, because one is creating the other. Now, when things like this go out of whack, well, that's when you can end up with things like osteoporosis. As women especially get old, they tend to have a lot less calcium in their system and in their bones, and that makes their bones weak and brittle, mainly because they had a parasite that was stealing calcium called their children. This could also connect to teenagers and kids. If we look at teenagers and kids, one thing they want to have in their diet is they want a diet that is rich in lots and lots of calcium, things like milk, cheese, meat especially. Those things are going to supply it because this can run things like your bones for building yourself, as well as your brain, because you can't fire a neuron without calcium, right? Helps your brain to figure out problems on the AP exam. Or we could say you've got a problem and you got bit by a tick, and that tick was carrying, Burgdorfia tetani, the tetanus bacteria. And those tetanus bacteria actually cause you to have too much calcium in your bloodstream, which is a problem because too much calcium can cause all your muscles to contract at the same time. And then you end up with lockjaw, and that locks off your ability to relax your diaphragm, and then you can't breathe. So you suffocate. But that's why you get a tetanus shot, right? Now, this is a nice graphic because it's showing that really it is a teeter-totter, and it's the balance between calcitonin and PTH to keep the blood levels from getting too high or getting too low. And that's why, of course, your thyroid function is pretty important, and doctors are always looking at thyroid because it doesn't just do that, it looks at your metabolism too. Now, the connection between this little fella right here and, of course, Grandma Simpson is shrunk, and a lot of women do, and her bones have become brittle because this little parasite stole calcium to build his own body from his mommy's milk. But that's why milk does the body good and why mammals are so reliant on it. That calcium allows us to build our bones, and that's why they chug lots of that milk to build themselves. That unfortunately leads to the fact that older women and women in general need to take calcium supplements to make sure that their bones don't become too fragile from all that parasite stealing it, right? Now, you would normally go after and take a look, and you should do it virtually with a buddy, and take a look at your 4 endocrine pathways poster. You'll hopefully notice that we've already done part of these. We just did PTH and calcitonin, and there's lots of other great ones. We've even done ADH before, the anti-peeing hormone. And knowing at least 4 of them will help you. Now, key things we should notice. In class, we would be looking at this video called the Discovery Channel, and it's the chemical clock. And the chemical clock is because the endocrine system is your body's timer. So hormones, especially when we take them in form of medication, need to be taken at a certain time because the timing and the concentration really determines how effective the hormone is, because it's all about setting your clock. And if you don't have the right hormone at the right time, then you don't get the right reaction, the right response from your cells. So we would look at GR45. We already started talking about this a bit last time and figured out that really, if we look at the endocrine system, it's a chemical control system. It sends out hormone messages that change what cells are doing. They respond. And when they do that, those messages then tell them to shut off things through a process called negative feedback from most of them. There's a little bit of positive feedback, but most of it's increased product shutdown process, right? A good example of it would be this, one of my favorite pictures from Kruger National Park. These folks decided to get way too close to a bull elephant, and they did that during a time that was a bad idea. Right now, if you look right there, that's its musk gland, and this elephant is extra aggressive because he's basically going through his yearly puberty, where his hormone levels go way up, and that is his must. And that must, of course, also leads to secretions out of his forehead, an oily, smelly one, and you can smell them. But the problem is all that extra testosterone makes this animal become agitated, kind of like football players, right? And teenage boys. And that makes them more aggressive. They also pulled closer to this bull elephant, so as he got more aggressive irrationally, he then, of course, took them as a competitor. And so then he used a faster system, which involves this great thing called nerve to send fast messages to his muscles inside of his trunk to control them, grab the car, and flip it off. At the same time, these people who are likely teenagers and making bad decisions because of the flood of hormones that's confused a lot of their cells are also going through fight or flight, where they release a hormone called epinephrine. And epinephrine causes them to change what their nerves do, which makes them pee their pants. So we can see that the fast responses of the nervous system are connected to the slower responses of the endocrine system. And the beauty of living things is we really need two different control systems. Endocrine does things through hormones, and they're the slower, longer-acting responses. Think puberty. They control how fast you get ready for reproduction, or if you do reproduce, how fast you develop, your energy, your metabolism, your growth, all things that take time to grow cells to change what the cells are doing. The nervous system is a fast and short-acting thing through synaptic signals that can cause muscles to contract and change your behavior rapidly. That's for reacting to your environment, whereas endocrine system is about reacting more slowly to changes of long-term environmental changes, right? Puberty. So there are a lot of glands to know. The ones that are the most important by far, as you can see, many organs are involved with those glands, or glands themselves, is things like the pituitary gland, which is, of course, the first part of it. The anterior pituitary is known as the master gland. It's the puppet master that basically tells all the other glands what to do. Then we can see the thyroid, which is involved heavily in not only calcium, but also your metabolism. There's other ones like your thymus, which also has T cell immune system functions. Your heart, your stomach, your organs, and we've talked a lot about, when in doubt, scrambled eggs. Then you can see, of course, there's the ovaries and testes, which are going to control things like your secondary sex characteristics, those messages that take years for your body to figure out what to do with them. Puberty. Now, key thing we should notice, how does your body control when it knows to grow, to metabolize sugars, when to jack up your heart rate, or when to prepare for reproduction? Well, that all comes down to timing, and that is, of course, the story of these internal secretions. Endo means within, and crine means separate, but really what you're doing is you're separating it from the cell to keep it inside the same system. So think of crine as secreting. We'll see crine in a couple other things, too. Now, one thing we talked about last class is the idea that when these endocrine cells communicate inside your body, they send it to everybody through the bloodstream. They send out the hormones. But only the target cells can read it because they have the right receptors. So good examples of a stimulus would be like you eat a bunch of carbs like we talked about last time, donuts, or you have too high or low a blood pressure, or you increase or decrease your temperature. You sense danger because you just saw a bear, or a baby starts crying and milk starts squirting out of somebody's mammary glands, or your oxygen level drops too low in your blood and you start to feel funny and suddenly you kick into fight or flight, right? Now, that because of course some of those are triggering these local and long distance signaling. Endocrine is good for broadcasting to the whole body, kind of like a total school announcement, or all those instructions I put on my Google Classroom that nobody reads, right? Paracrine means beside the secretion. This is where one cell is just telling the cells next to it what to do. That, of course, is a bossy neighbor. This is like the hedgehog pathway, the hedgehog signaling pathway that causes cancer. And then the weirdest one, of course, is the autocrine signaling, because this all evolved from single cell creatures that used to tell themselves what to do by sending messages to receptors in their membranes. That then evolved further to become an endocrine system where you could tell your entire huge cooperating cells what to do. Then there's the nervous system, where most of what we care about is the synaptic responses, where a nerve cell very quickly tells a cell what to do by sending these synaptic signals across a cleft with neurotransmitters. Or you can tie the two together and you can have a neurotransmitter that then causes secretions to move across, such as epinephrine does, to cause changes in the tissues, vasodilation or vasoconstriction. So, hormones. Hormones come in three different classes. The ones that end with ins, like insulin, melatonin, they tend to be the proteins, and proteins, of course, are hydrophilic. They like water, so they only work on the outside. Then there's the ones you probably heard of called lipids, but people typically call them steroids. Steroids are the fat-based ones. They can sneak through the club and tell a lot of cells what to do. It's harder to control what they do because they can migrate throughout, right? Kind of sounds like puberty, where you can't control it. It spreads to all the cells and causes lots of changes. Then there's another group called the amines. They, of course, have amino groups in them. And with the amines, they're also hydrophilic. So there's things like epinephrine, because they end with the ene at the end of them. They, of course, only work on the outsides. So a really good example of these steroids at work in these fatty ones would be, say, testosterone and estradiol, estrogen. You can see they have basically 3 pies in a doghouse, but the small change in the functional groups that we've talked about before in the year gives them their ability to work with different receptors. Now, when you have a female lion, you can actually take a female lion and turn it into a male lion, like all males did of our species as well. We all started as female. And as that testosterone goes out, it spreads to all the cells and can cause changes like extra hair to grow on the face, extra large mass to grow on shoulders. You can even, of course, increase their aggression, because all those changes are being triggered by this fatty hormone going wherever it wants. Estrogen will do the same thing, but in opposite directions. It will cause them, of course, to secrete milk and get ready for reproduction of making little baby cubs, right? So if we look at another example of the idea of you can have the same hormone but different effects, it all comes down to the receptors and which target cells do what. So let's see that you see a bear or that lion that was on the other page. You're going to go into fight or flight. And what's going to happen? Well, one thing is epinephrine, which we commonly call adrenaline, is going to be released. It's going to tell liver cells, because they have beta receptors, to actually kick their glucose out and break down glycogen so you have extra sugar so you can run away from the bear faster, right? Or the lion. At the same time, epinephrine is going to go to the blood vessels that are things like your skeletal muscles, your extremities. It's going to send those out so that you can, of course, increase and vasodilate, so you have more energy, more oxygen, and more sugar flowing through your blood to make your skeletal muscles run faster. At the same time, the same epinephrine goes to an alpha receptor in things like your intestines and your bladder, and it causes them to vasoconstrict. So you're not wasting your energy trying to digest your meal or figuring out what to do with your pee when you're being chased by a lion. So one message can be read in different ways from the same endocrine cell that's sending it out. It's kind of like one teacher tells a story and everybody hears their own version of it. It's like a private universe thing. Yeah. Now, how does your body know when to stop secreting hormones? That, of course, stopping is all about negative feedback. We've talked about it with secretin, where it's basically shutting off the response because you increase the product, the hormone, which shut off the process, which eventually shuts off the production of the hormone, right? It's mostly negative feedback. Now, glucagon and insulin are looking at blood sugar. We talked about them exhaustively last time. But if we look at diabetes mellitus, because it affects a lot of people, there are 2 different types. There's type 1. This is an insulin dependent. Now, this isn't the people's fault. It's they have genes that makes their immune system, because it's an autoimmune disorder, actually attack the beta cells in their islets of Langerhans, and it kills its own beta cells so that you can't actually detect and then produce insulin to make sugar go back into the cells. So you have too much blood sugar. Type 2 is a different story, and it's growing in commonality. It's non-insulin dependent, because this is just the fact of you ate too many donuts, you didn't like exercise, and loading up all of that sugar in your body, eventually your beta cells are like, dude, okay, there's sugar, I don't care anymore. It's been overexposed to it, and it stops putting out as many receptors. That's why type 2 is really more about you and your choices in health. Type 1, you can't really do anything. It's genetic, whereas type 2, it's really about your decisions. Now, the name diabetes mellitus comes from the fact of when somebody has diabetes, there's too much sugar in their blood, so the body tries, it diffuses out of the body. And one way to do that is it shows up in the urine. It also will show up in the sweat, so their sweat will smell sweet, their urine will smell sweet, and their breath will smell sweet because they got extra sugar in their system. That's why diabetes mellitus refers to honey. Their urine looked like and smelled like honey, so did their breath, which meant that something was probably a bit off. And it's because they were having too much blood sugar. It wasn't going into the cells to be stored. Cool things about this, of course, is there are glands, but the master gland is known as the pituitary, and the most important part of that, the puppet master, is the anterior pituitary. They're located right below the hypothalamus, but most of the work is done by the pituitary gland. And if we look at that, the anterior pituitary, here's a list of all the hormones the anterior pituitary makes. And then there's the list of those that are just basically processed through the posterior. So when you're in doubt on your exam, if it's not pancreas, it's probably anterior pituitary, right? It does most of those. And we can see that it actually has what's called a tropic gland. Tropic means it's a gland that tells other glands what to do. Whereas non-tropic would be something like telling your kidneys when to go pee. That's a non-gland response. It's telling other tissues. And that's why the puppet master is a tropic gland. It sends out tropic hormones telling other hormones what to do, and it does a lot for you. Now, the types of hormones they can send out, we already talked about, are those protein and amines that are water-soluble, hydrophilic. They like to be in solution. And those that are fat-soluble, the steroid hormones. Things like testosterone, cortisol that you wake up with in the morning. Now, key things we can see with that is being water soluble means that they can travel around outside of the cell, but they can't go through the membrane. So they have to work with signal receptors at the surface, which should make you think of signal reception, transduction, and cellular response. This is things like insulin or melatonin. These are those proteins that are working on the outside. Whereas things that are fat-soluble, like testosterone, they sneak into the club and they use intercellular receptors and usually turn on genes, such as the genes to grow extra hair on your face because you're going into your secondary sex characteristics. So this sneaking into the club was examined pretty well with frogs, in this example in your book, where there's this thing called MSH, which stands for melanocyte stimulating hormone. Anytime it's an SH, it's a stimulating hormone. Now, the melanocytes, of course, are the cells, just like the ones you have in your body, that if you get exposed to UV, they will, of course, make you darker to try to protect you. In frogs, they have those melanocytes because we're related to amphibians, and they wanted to know with MSH, the hormone, how did it work? Well, they took it and they injected it into the frog cells, and nothing happened. And then they took it and they injected it outside of the actual frog cells. And when they injected it outside of them, one of the things that we can see is the cells responded, which told them that, well, MSH must be a protein-based water-soluble one because it only works on the receptors on the surface of the cell. If it was a hormone steroid, then it would work probably better on the inside because of an intracellular receptor. AP loves examples like that to follow. The lion, of course, is a really good example of it, as well as the rest of us, of why guys grow beards or you grow hair in weird places like your armpits as you go through puberty. It's because those are sneaking around to all the different parts of your body and causing either your hips to widen or your shoulders to widen or your voice to crack because it's turning on new genes to grow different things, like your voice box larger so you sound like an intimidating man, right? That's because they are, of course, fat-soluble. And they can travel through any. If you ever run into somebody who is later in life, their testosterone levels are dropping and they have a testosterone cream like a grandpa, you might not want to come near that grandpa because, well, if you touch that hormone, it can transfer through your skin and actually cause changes in your body. So you have to be careful about that kind of stuff, right? This also means that most hormone treatments, you can also give them by putting them on the outside or putting them in a pill, whereas other hormones that aren't fat-based steroid ones, you can take in a pill. So it depends on what the doctor wants to do for your body. Now, hopefully this is ringing a bell in terms of those that are hydrophilic. They have to use extracellular receptors, which should make you think of, hey, reception, get across the cell by transduction, and cellular response. Turn a gene on, turn a gene off. You also hopefully are thinking of things like the G protein to get things done fast, or tyrosine kinase to amplify them, or ion channel receptors, which work a lot with, protein-based receptors, which cause them to allow you to think. Or there's the old sneak into the club intracellular. It's like the whole year is connected. Now, crucially, that also brings back the idea of cellular response, which often has to do with turning genes on, gene expression, TNT. Make sure you know the differences between bacteria and eukaryotes, pre-mRNA versus mRNA, and what's going on after those phases. Now, make sure that you've got at least 3. I would make sure that you go after some of the ones that we haven't done, like TSH is pretty darn handy. Epinephrine, we talked a bit about. Prolactin, FSH, they like those ones. I'm writing in black, but you can't see it because it's a black screen. I'll get over it. The other ones we've hit a bit. Make sure you know at least 4 of them for the exam. Now, normally we take a quiz, but your quiz is a Jeopardy game. And I'm going to make the Jeopardy available to you on the Google Classroom. You can go through it and give you a good idea of whether or not you're ready for this after you do your posters and know your endocrine system, because it's mighty complex. And some great names that I've seen in the past, with endocrine, the secretion sisters. Oxytocin is a verb. And then Bronson is impairing my hormone secretions, one of my favorite ones of all time. And the glucocorticoid girls. Cool. That finishes off, of course, what I'm going to do for the endocrine system, but you can see that we're digging into the nervous system next, as well as sensory organs. The endocrine system is not a simple one. I would use your poster to get yourself ready for next week when we test you to see whether or not you actually know all the pathways and what they're linked to. Usually their name gives you a hint. Our next review is coming up, and hopefully you'll be ready for that, where we go after the following FRQ. Should be 2017 on that day. All right, when it's all about timing, it's about the endocrine system, which is about long-term responses in your body, whereas the nervous system is all about the fast stuff. All right, have a